Welcome, everyone. I am Father Michael Azar from the University of Scranton, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. And my thanks especially to Fordham University's Orthodox Christian Study Center, which is sponsoring this webinar. For those that are interested in the ongoing events and other offerings of the Orthodox Christian Study Center, you can find out more through their e-magazine's website at publicorthodoxy.org or through their YouTube channel. And I've been asked to remind you, as always, to like the videos because it deeply affects the algorithm. Last October, prior to the start of the most recent year of violence around, in, and against Gaza, and now shifting to Lebanon as well, there were, by most estimates, around 1,000 Christians residing in the tiny strip of land, around a third of the size of the county in which I now live. As you will hear in more detail today, the vast majority of these were Orthodox Christians, affiliated with St. Porphyrios Church in Gaza City, with other Christians affiliated with the Catholic Church of the Holy Family, also in Gaza City, and a few others. By and large, the Christian population of Gaza has remained under the world's radar in the past year. On the one hand, this makes sense. 1,000 people out of 2 million is a tiny fraction. Yet on the other hand, this oversight is disheartening because it is tiny minorities like this that stand the most risk of disappearing entirely in a war this destructive. While Archbishop Alexios has remained with his parish in Gaza since the beginning, and Patriarch Theophilus together, between the two of them, have called repeatedly and unequivocally for ceasefire and for the Israeli military to allow humanitarian aid to flow unhindered, much of the rest of the Orthodox world outside of the Holy Land has been surprisingly quiet. There have been general calls from hierarchs for peace and so forth, but little has been said directly about the violence under which the community of St. Porphyrios has fallen or about those responsible. It seems rather that the Orthodox world has chosen to occupy itself primarily with the Russian-Ukrainian war, or to speak out against Turkey on behalf of Greece or Cyprus, to speak of atrocities in those contexts, but little of the atrocities surrounding their Orthodox brothers and sisters in the Church of St. Porphyrios, or in later months, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, where matters have been getting progressively worse. This is an aspect of the Orthodox world that I believe should change, and one hopes that this webinar will help in that regard. We will approach the plight of Christians in Gaza from 3 angles this afternoon or evening, depending on where in the world you find yourselves. First, we will hear from the accomplished historian of Arab Orthodoxy, Dr. Sam Noble, regarding the history of Orthodox Christians in Gaza and the wider region. Second, we will turn to Hannah Benkowski of the Jerusalem Center for Jewish Christian Relations at the Rossing Center for Education and Dialogue, who will explore the church-state relationship within the state of Israel especially. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Yusuf El-Houri of Bethlehem Bible College, who, though currently living in the Bethlehem area, comes from Gaza City, where his family continues to shelter. Each talk will be about 15 minutes, so that the remaining 40 or so minutes will be left for Q&A. So first, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Sam Noble.
Thank you. So in my allotted time here, I will give a sort of, I guess, drier historical overview, taking the sort of first 1900 years of Orthodox Christianity in Gaza and Palestine to sort of, well, set up, for one thing, simply how important Gaza was in the formation of later Orthodox Christianity. So if we speak about things starting geographically, it's important to remember that Gaza, uh, at least in late antiquity and in the Byzantine period, was an immensely wealthy trading center. So along with its port city of Mayuma, which also has its own very important Orthodox Christian history. And so geographically, it was the southernmost major port on the Eastern Mediterranean. And it was also the first, or if you're going the other direction, the last major stop on the land route between Roman Syria and Egypt, and sort of the final port city along the trade route going down to the Arabian Peninsula on the incense trade. Um, Unlike a lot of the rest of Palestine, Gaza was a major Greek-speaking center in late antiquity. That is, it had a native Greek-speaking population that was self-sustaining, apart from the monastic populations and pilgrim populations. And it also was sort of one of the last holdouts of Greco-Roman paganism in the Middle East. But because of its very close associations through trade and geography to Alexandria, it was an important Roman intellectual center. It was very famous in the 5th and 6th centuries for its rhetorical and philosophical school that began pagan but developed into a Christian intellectual center. And so it was, I mean, for the purpose of the modern church in Gaza, whose name it bears, it was the home of St. Procopius of Gaza, who was an important biblical exegete and theologian in the Alexandrian mold. But it was also the home of the Desert Father, St. Isaiah the Solitary. It was the sort of, well, it was the final home of the founder of Palestinian monasticism, St. Hilarion, who was originally an Egyptian, and of another Egyptian who might be familiar to many Orthodox Christians, St. Barsanuphius of Gaza, who's famous for his correspondence with the Gazan monk John, that's found in the Philokalia, as well as of John's pupil Dorotheus of Gaza, who's also important Philokalic father. So in that period, that is the late or the sort of the last century or two of Byzantine rule over Gaza, the sort of spiritual program and spiritual practices in the monasteries there were seminal for what became later Orthodox Christian spirituality. Then there came the sort of the disasters in the early 7th century with the Persian conquest of Palestine, and which was very quickly followed by the Muslim conquest of Palestine. Jerusalem was taken in 637 and Gaza in 638. But it's important to point out that during this period, even before the Muslim conquest, there were some major changes happening within the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. Now, Gaza itself had, because of its intellectual and monastic profile, it had been something of a center for anti-Chalcedonian thought. And some of the monasteries there were strongly opposed to Chalcedon. But the Patriarchate of Jerusalem itself, and Palestine more generally, were very, very important centers for, well, the defense of Chalcedon. And in what this developed into was also it became a center of opposition to monothelitism. That is, the Byzantine imperial theology or ideology that promoted the idea of a single divine will in Christ, kind of as, well, it's a bit more complicated, but really, I guess you could say as a compromise with monothelitism. And so figures very closely associated with the church in Jerusalem, like Maximus the Confessor, who was himself a native of northern Palestine, Sophronius of Jerusalem, and John Moskos, were key to resistance against this imperial doctrine in the decades before the Islamic conquest. And it's been pointed out, and I think this is really important for understanding the medieval church in Jerusalem. So it's been pointed out by the British historian Phil Booth that the doctrinal resistance in the Church of Jerusalem to this ideology led to the development under Sophronius of what Booth has called a post-Roman identity among the leadership of the church in Jerusalem. And this, I think, is quite important, at least in my role as a historian, to remember that when we're talking about the history, even of Orthodox Christianity in the Middle East, and especially the Church of Jerusalem in the Middle Ages, that it's not just a funny subset of Byzantine Christianity or Byzantine history. It really develops in the 7th century into its own thing that has its own internal dynamic that's quite distinct from Byzantium. Um, so there's, well, it would talk about early Islamic rule, uh, and it may be because of this known break with Constantinople that Muslim rulers in the early Islamic period, that is, in the very beginning, and then under the Umayyad Caliphate, which was based in Damascus, the rulers tended, on the one hand, to favor the local Orthodox Christian elites, most famously John of Damascus's family, and um, and to promote their brand of Chalcedonianism over and against other forms of Christianity within the Caliphate. And so they formed in this period kind of, well, I guess you could term it the sub elite of the Umayyad Caliphate. This is helped along by the fact that the early Islamic administration, for the first century or so, remained in Greek, and so remained in the day to day in the hands of Orthodox Christian bureaucrats who were still able to, well, write up the documents and deal with things in Greek. On the other hand, though, of course, ordinary Christians who are not of this sub elite were subject to a variety of legal disabilities and uh, as non-Muslims, which grew and slowly developed over time. And in this early period, among the Orthodox Christians, unlike uh, other Christian groups in the Caliphate, there developed a very strong cult of martyrs, many of which were associated with Palestine uh, in this period, uh, such as Peter of Capitolius and various other ones. And so there's a kind of unique dynamic of being very close to the state, but having a fraught relationship to the state. There is, however, in this early period, another very, very formative cultural shift. And so if we look at the early 8th century, we still have, uh, we can still see the life of the church in Palestine being conducted in Greek on every level, not just liturgically, but also administratively and in the theology. So in the early 8th century, we have figures like John of Damascus, who's closely associated in the latter part of his career with Jerusalem and with the Church of the Anastasis, and his, we could say, foster brother, Cosmas of Mayuma, that is, he was bishop of the port city of Gaza, who set the course of basically later Byzantine liturgy. I mean, they wrote many of the hymns that we still use. But if we take sort of the conventional death date for John of Damascus in 750, this is quite convenient as a kind of cultural divide, because also around 750, there's a new Islamic dynasty, the Abbasids, that have a revolution that came from the east. And in the middle of the 8th century, they build the new capital for their dynasty in Baghdad, which is right next to the former capital of the Persian Empire, Ctesiphon. And so we see a shift in, uh, well, because of our sources, Palestinian monastic life, where previously the pilgrimage churches of Palestine and the monasteries in Palestine, especially, they had, up until about the middle 8th century, they had recruited sort of throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world. They had primarily been Greek speaking for this reason. But quite quickly, in the middle of the 8th century, they largely start getting their monks from Syria, even from Mesopotamia, and sort of the core areas of the Caliphate. And what this leads to is a major language shift within Palestinian and then later Syrian and Egyptian Orthodoxy. And the languages or the language of church administration and the language of theological life very quickly moved to be almost entirely in Arabic. And there comes to be a very strong attachment to Arabic, um, as the language of Christian life, starting in the 8th century, very strongly from the 9th century on. Um, though, and I'll also say that this took place a century among the Chalcedonian Orthodox earlier than it did among any of the other Middle Eastern Christian groups, and it was much more thorough uh, than among any of the other Middle Eastern Christian groups. The transition from Greek to Arabic was um, very profound in a way that, say, among the Syriacs or the Copts, it wasn't necessary. But sort of, I guess, as an aside, throughout Palestine, down till maybe 13th, 14th century, local parish churches, unlike the monasteries and the pilgrimage centers, uh, didn't, or in their liturgical life at least, they kept their own language. That is, they used a language called Palestinian Christian Aramaic, which is very close to the language of the Palestinian Talmud, but, well, with a lot of Greek influence, that uh, was distinct and only used among Orthodox Christians in Palestine as a liturgical language. So there was also, in addition to sort of the broad imperial languages of Arabic and Greek, there was still a distinct local particularity that lived on. Now, the implosion of the Abbasid Caliphate, say in the 10th century, was quite harmful for Palestine's Christians. So in 969, the Egyptian Fatimid Caliphate conquered Palestine. And while the Fatimids, in their broad strokes, tended to be hands off, it was economically disastrous. And a very idiosyncratic caliph, Al-Hakim Amr-Allah, who, well, believed himself to be God, in the year 1009 destroyed the Church of the Anastasis, which was only rebuilt 50 years later with Byzantine funding and support. But probably, or maybe, or probably during this period, we also have the most important Christian Arabic writer who's closely associated with Gaza, a bishop by the name of Suleiman al-Ghazi, so Solomon of Gaza, who was the first author of an entirely and very self-consciously Christian poetic corpus in Arabic. So he's quite we don't have any outside sources from outside of his poetic diwan, but he is very autobiographical in his writing. So we know at the very least that he was first very successful in the world and then became a monk upon the death of his wife and son, who he's constantly weaving in laments for his family with his laments for the destruction of the holy places in Palestine. And, well, he writes in a sort of semi-colloquial Arabic, and he breaks meter, and so he's not popular among Arabic language critics, but he reads quite wonderfully if you're not very sensitive to Arabic meter. And the scholar Sidney Griffith has described his work as haunting poems of grief and religious fervor. And, well, I thought I would read part of one of his poems in my own translation here. So, not all baptized with water are Christians without the baptism of the life of the world to come. In Christ, the people of the earth have been baptized, though some of them afterwards showed hypocrisy. They became like a body's parts in its natural state, some helpful, some unreliable. How many patriarchs are unpraiseworthy in their service, miserable bishops and metropolitans, who are among the heretics in place of truth, preferring falsehood and slander. Over them God has favored a church whose stones are gathered from all corners and climes. Truth has built her an edifice, rising to heaven on pillars and columns fashioned from chrysolite, precious stones, sapphires, and emeralds. Her foundation is the rock of faith, rooted deep with pillars and walls. All bodily creatures are pleased to see it when it appears in races and colors. Romans, Russians, and Franks joined with Indians, Khuzastanis, Abkhaz, and Alans, Armenians and Pechenegs in agreement with the people of the Jazeera, namely Haran. And Copts too of the Lower Egypt gathered together from Upper Egypt to Kus and Aswan. And I could go on, but it's my point here is that even sort of in this quite difficult period in the Middle Ages when the holy places were being destroyed, um, there was not only this Arabic literary sense, but there was also this sense still of the Holy Land as being the center of a Christian ecumeny, a multicultural Christian ecumeny that I find quite still relevant and resonant today. But uh, to go back to, I suppose, a drier historical discussion, if you have this, then, or if you're in the 10th century and the 11th century, the Crusades happen. And again, this was quite deeply disastrous for indigenous uh, Christian life in the Holy Land. The Crusaders practiced what one scholar has termed rough tolerance of the local Christians. They saw them as heretics, and they had a subaltern status relative to the settler Western Christians. Um, but their life continued on to some degree. And what's interesting about this period is that this is when a sort of Byzantinization or re-Byzantinization happens really rapidly. That is, Byzantine canon law starts being translated into Arabic, and where before the canon law corpus used had been quite distinct, the liturgy becomes quite more Byzantine in its practice, and um, there comes sort of the first sort of seeds of a dependence on Constantinople that would develop further over the course of the subsequent centuries. To move quickly further on, um, things were even worse after the Crusaders. The another Egyptian dynasty, the Mamluks, conquer Palestine in the mid 13th century and are absolutely deleterious for any kind of Christian life. And this goes on until the Ottomans in at the very beginning of the 16th century. Now, the when I guess in a lot of Orthodox Christian historiography, the Ottomans are obviously seen as a disaster. They take Constantinople, they end Orthodox Christian autonomy, basically outside of the Slavic world. But for the Christians of the Middle East, it's quite more complicated, really, because on the one hand, there's um, economic opportunity improves greatly. The major port centers in major cities of Greater Syria and the Holy Land are once more connected to the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean in a way that they hadn't been in centuries. Um, and and pilgrimage basically becomes something that can happen on a large scale again. And this develops, well, as we go on over the course of the Ottoman centuries. In Palestine, though, what happens is the development of a different type of church administrative life. Prior to the Ottomans, the patriarchs themselves of Jerusalem had often been totally incommunicado and off doing their own thing in Constantinople, or were often simply titular bishops appointed in Constantinople that had uh, relatively little to do with church life itself in Palestine. But under the Ottomans, there developed what's called the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre, which is made up of Greek-speaking monks who, over the first couple Ottoman centuries, develop a kind of cartel over the upper clergy in Palestine and come to more or less entirely control it. This is made possible by also the fact that outside patrons are very eager to give alms and to give land holdings to the church in Jerusalem. And so the Patriarchate of Jerusalem and the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre become major landholders, especially in the Ottoman, suzerain or subject principalities in what's today's Romania, in Wallachia and Moldavia. And so the economic life of the Patriarchate itself becomes entirely dependent on land holdings, largely in modern Romania. Um, and I will say that I said that the Brotherhood was dominated by Greek monks. There is one really fascinating exception to this. That is, there was one Arabic speaker who became patriarch in the Ottoman period. He was Sophronius V of Jerusalem, uh, who was an Arabic speaker from Syria and was very active in opposition to um, Roman Catholic missionaries in Syria and then in Palestine, which is largely the main preoccupation of the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre. They're interested in keeping Orthodox control over the major pilgrimage sites. But Sophronius is especially interesting because he became, in the 1770s, the only Arab to have been Patriarch of Constantinople. So he's sort of a bit of an exception that proves the rule here. Um, and just to close, there's one last, in the Ottoman period, major development in the life of the Church of Palestine, connected both to the pilgrimage and, well, to politics. And that's the arrival of the Russians. So, in the Ottoman period, the Brother of the Holy Sepulchre had attempted on and off to do some degree of education among the Christians of Palestine, but even including printing Arabic books. But it had always been kind of ad hoc, very poorly organized, and they had an emphasis on trying to teach Greek to people who had very little interest in Greek. But as Russia kind of came to remember the possibility of Christians in the Holy Land so in the 16th, 17th centuries, they had been giving alms and had been starting to send a lot of pilgrims. In the 19th century, as Russia starts competing with the Ottoman Empire in earnest, they take much greater interest. And there's in the second half of the 19th century, the establishment of what's called the Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society that set up everyday schools for Orthodox Christians, especially in Palestine. The really major center was in Nazareth, but also in Syria and elsewhere. And one of the things that they did was emphasizing Arabic language education. There was a very practical reason for this. And there's documents attesting to this. So they thought it out in precisely these terms, that they knew that the British Protestant missionaries were teaching in English and the French Catholic missionaries were teaching in French. But they realized that using Russian would have gone against their purposes because and Russian was only useful in the Russian Empire. And they thought that, okay, if we create an elite in Palestine who can speak Russian, we would uh, basically have a lot of immigrants trying to get bureaucratic jobs in St. Petersburg. So there's no sense in that. So, unlike any other missionary group in this period, they emphasized very strongly Arabic education. And this uh, was one of the factors in, well, what's called the Arabic Nahda, the revival of Arabic literature in the 19th century. And so there was, because of this Russian influence, a very strong Orthodox Christian presence in broader, non religious Arabic social life and political life that who's even to now we still feel the effects of this. Um, and addition, there was one other major event that I'll close with before. I'm not going to go into the British mandate in this. I'll let the other speakers talk about 20th century developments. But there was one final development that was very formative for the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, and that was in the middle of the 19th century. The Romania became a united country. So Romania gets formal independence from the Ottomans, and the at least initially the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia unite. And part of this involved the freedom of slaves who had often been who were mostly of Romani background and were often owned by monasteries, and the seizure of monastic lands to a large extent in the new country. And this took away the economic basis of the Patriarchate of Jerusalem that became quite a crisis during the British Mandate. And so we see, I guess, at the end of the Ottoman period, a new dynamic that's taking place with a much more self-confident, educated, Arabic-speaking lay intellectual class that is locked out, basically, of control over the Patriarchate. In addition to the Patriarchate having a financial crisis due to losing its lands in Romania. And this would, go on to inform much of how the Patriarchate of Jerusalem behaves in the 20th century. I'll leave you there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sam. We'll move next to Hannah Benkowski, and I forgot to mention at the beginning, if anybody has any questions that they don't want to save to the end, feel free to enter them into the Q&A and we'll get to them later on. But Hannah, I turn it to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I will jump to the 21st century. The reality in our part of the world has always been marked by instability and constant changes, but in the recent years, and especially in the past year, it feels like we have been on a roller coaster of events. Each new day seems to bring more bad news. And just when I think things cannot possibly get worse, I'm proven wrong. We are living in a time where men, women, and children are enduring in unimaginable suffering, a time of relentless bloodshed, pain, and a tsunami of hatred, to quote the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, as it resonates deeply with the atmosphere in both Jewish and Palestinian societies, but now also with Lebanese. Since the topic of this webinar was chosen, the relevance has only grown, although so many things have happened since our first conversation with Father Michael. I've been asked to address the state-church relations, State of Israel, which is part of my work in the field of Jewish-Christian relations in the unique context of Israel. To tackle the issue of the state-church relations, we must first begin with an overview of Jewish-Christian relations in the first century, present the complex of dynamics during the early days of Christianity in the East, then involving relationship between Jews and Christians in the West, then the development of Jewish-Christian dialogue in the Western context, and only after this historical groundwork, we can return back to the East, to the Holy Land, and explore the unique nature of Jewish-Christian relations here in the 20th and 21st centuries, ultimately leading to the discussion of the state approach toward Christian communities. But we're not going to do that. I'm just going to jump to the end. But to illustrate this complexity, I would like to quote the words of the Israel First Prime Minister, as translated and presented in Dr. Amnon Ramon's book, Christian and Christianity in the Jewish State, that was published by the Jerusalem Institute for Policy Studies in collaboration with the Rossing Center. I'm holding the Hebrew version, but it also exists in English. On January 24th, 1952, Israel First Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion gave a speech to the political committee of the dominant Mapai party, presenting his view on the problem of the Arabs in the state of Israel, 1952. Among other issues, Ben-Gurion considered the status of the Christian Arabs communities in the Jewish state. His following comments represent the complex attitude of the Israeli establishment toward these communities. Quote, and there is another fact that must not be ignored, that Arabs belong to two religions. Most of them are Muslims. This religion was founded on a sword and educated to the sword. That's his view of Muslims. But a smaller portion are Christians. And this portion too, or at least part of it, is Catholic and fundamentally hostile to the independent Jewish nation, since this contradiction to basic dogma of Catholicism, that because the Jews failed to accept Jesus of Nazareth and crucified him, they are forced to wander in the world. And another part is Orthodox, and they're connected to Russia, and Russia is considered to be very influential. This is not ordinary matter of a minority. On the other hand, we are not an ordinary state like all the others. Our state has a greater affinity to the world than many states around the globe. It will not be easy for us to survive if at least a large portion of the world does not respect us. But even more than this state has affinity to the world, it has an affinity to the diaspora. And everything we do in the land has to echo around the world and has an echo in the diaspora. And it's liable to influence the condition of Jews around the world. Any offensive we can cause to Arabs in the state of Israel, real or imagined, will have tremendous echo in the world. And there is virtually no state in the world that does not have enemies of ours, for anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is well-rooted global phenomena that has existed for many centuries. And this is liable to harm us and liable to harm Judaism. End of the quote of Ben-Gurion. Thus, Ben-Gurion saw the Christian Arab communities in Israel as belonging to two circles of hostility to Israel: the pan-Arab circle in the Middle East, which sees the Jewish citizen of Israel as the minority that took their land, and the Christian circle, which cannot recognize the Jewish state for theological reasons. Despite this underlying hostility of these communities toward Israel, Ben-Gurion argues that the young state must take into account the position of the Christian world, that is to say, the position of the West on which Israel depends on. Moreover, steps against Muslim and Christian in Israel are liable to lead the deterioration of the status of the Jewish communities in the diaspora. Ben-Gurion's perception has not significantly changed in Israel. While Israel is aware of the theological changes occurring in the Christendom, particularly with the various Protestant churches and the Catholic Church, the general attitude remains one of respect and suspect, which is a Talmudic concept. Even after the Catholic Church theological changes following the Second Vatican Council statements, where it's declared that God's gifts are irrevocable and rejected the theology of contempt, there has been a little change in the Israeli perception. Despite the Vatican recognition of the State of Israel, the establishment of diplomatic relation, the friendly visit of the Pope, the supportive stance of European Protestant churches burdening the guilt of historical anti-Semitism, and the backing of the evangelical Zionist group, Israel still harbor no deep trust or sense of mutuality toward the Christian world. The lack of trust is especially evident in the current climate, where Israel is at war, and position of both sides, Israel, Jews and Palestinians, have become more polarized. Each side expects complete empathy for their own side, and for many Israeli officials, any criticism of the state of Israel from Christian Western world justifies the lack of trust and illustrate that the roots of anti-Semitism has not yet been uprooted. And obviously, it's subjective interpretation of the reality. The Christian communities in the Holy Land are diverse. Leadership is divided into more than 13 communities officially recognized by the state since the Ottoman time, and others that are not officially recognized but treated as by the state on de facto basis. Each community operates independently, driven by its own diverse interest and unique jurisdiction, which often includes people from different national backgrounds. In some cases, the leadership is not coming from among the local community, as was mentioned by Dr. Noble. Although church leaders have increased cooperation, this usually results in only moderate, cautious statements. An exception to this was 2018, when the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was closed for 3 days. But in a harsh and assertive environment of the Middle East, and especially the Holy Land, communities that do not make noise, cause problems, or assert their presence with strength often go unnoticed and invisible. Christian, to quote an advisor of the mayor of Jerusalem, former advisor, seen as too nice and often faced indifferent as a result. The state approach toward the church has always been pragmatic. However, unlike Ben-Gurion's generation and the state founders, the second and third generation suffer from two other weaknesses. First, it's ignorance. While the founder of the state lived among Christians, had European education, and were familiar with the Christian cultural world, most Israelis today now know very little. About 80% of Israelis were born in Israel, including those who work in the governmental ministries, municipalities, and state institutions, and they often lack any understanding of Christianity. This ignorance leads to apathy or disinterest at best, or at worst, a reliance on historical prejudice rooted in lessons about persecution, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust. A clear example for this connect is seen in the Ministry of Tourism, where recent ministries have focused on promoting beaches, nature, and culinary tourism while neglecting Christian tourism, which remained the country's most important source of tourism. The state fails to view Christian as an integral part of the Holy Land's history. It ignores the fact that Christianity and the Christian world has played a crucial role in defining the land as holy. Instead, Christians are often seen merely in terms of their economic or political benefits. A second weakness that has grown over the years in the increasing embrace of the idea of Israel as people who live apart, to quote Bilam from the book of Numbers. In the state early decades, decisions regarding the churches were guided by awareness of the world's interest in the holy sites and the concern over how Christians might react to drastic measures. For example, the foreign ministry blocked efforts in the 1950s to pass a law completely banning Christian missions, resulting instead in a law that only prohibits converting minors without parental consent or offering material benefits for conversion. Or after the occupation of East Jerusalem in 1967, the law of protection of holy places was passed to demonstrate Israel's commitment to safeguarding Christian sites. However, this has changed. Israel is increasingly adopting an attitude of self-reliance, as that exemplified by the phrase, "My power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me," from Deuteronomy 8, and is less concerned about international criticism, including from the Christian world. Nonetheless, there is still some awareness that each Christian community and organization is backed with millions of believers, influential countries, and powerful international Christian figures. We can refer to three categories of Christian and the state attitudes toward them. The local Christians, indigenous, including Palestinian Christians, citizens of Israel, and residents of East Jerusalem. And I will not relate to the West Bank because this is another category and story, and we will need another lecture for that. Foreign Christians, mainly clergy, serving in the country, and Christians from abroad involved in Israeli affairs. I will start with the local Christian, with indigenous Christians. They embody the dual identity that Ben-Gurion feared, as both Christians and Palestinians. As Palestinians, they face similar challenges to their Muslim counterparts, such as difficulties in applying for citizenship for Jerusalem residents and restrictions of family reunification with West Bank Palestinians who granted temporary status instead of permanent status. They also encounter obstacles with building permits and often face hostility from security forces and authorities. Like all Palestinians, they feel silent more than ever this year and are afraid to express empathy for Christian and Muslims in Gaza. For the Christian identity perspective, there is an expectation that they would be less involved in the Palestinian national struggle and therefore less subject to suspicion. In the aftermath of the Arab Spring, which failed to bring equality and democratization in many of the Arab countries, there were attempts to emphasize a distinct Christian identity within Palestinian population, even encouraging to identify as Aramaic rather than Arab. This shift was not only intended to reshape Christian identity, but also allowed individuals to officially register as Aramaic in the Israeli population registry. Those who embraced this identity change received a warm welcome from the state authorities, as it was seen as less threatening than the Arab identity. The state supported Christian association and initiative promoting military and national service for Christians. Local Christian activists engaged in wartime propaganda are particularly favored by the state. Palestinian Christian citizens of Israel who sought to integrate into the Israeli society for pragmatic reasons, however, they found themselves marginalized once again following the enactment of the nation-state law in 2018, which declared the state of Israel as a nation-state for the Jewish people. Israeli officials often proudly state that the Christian population in Israel has remained stable compared to the rest of the Middle East. However, there's a little real understanding of the local Christian community's deep connection to the Holy Land. They are often viewed as religious guests rather than as part of the indigenous population. I'm not going to refer to other Christians who live in Israel, including migrant workers, asylum seekers, who numbered the local indigenous Christian. This is, again, another lecture. I want to jump to the clergy and their relation with the state, or the state relation with them. Clergy serving in Israel act as diplomats, navigating the various authorities and communities that interact with. Most church leaders oversees their jurisdiction across multiple countries and must maintain positive relations with Jordan, Palestine, and Israel simultaneously. They rely on Israel for visas and transit permits, such as access to Gaza or entry of clergy from Muslim countries in the Middle East. While their ecclesiastical court operates independently and are not funded or supervised by the state, their rulings are enforced by the government. Moreover, their institution, the church institutions, including schools and hospitals, work in close cooperation with the state authorities and are recognized as leaders in their fields. One pressing issue in this context is real estate, as again mentioned, a very important issue by the previous speaker, including the sale, purchase, and permits associated with the properties. The state often disregards the interest of the churches in these matters. Additionally, the state seeks to impose local taxes on church-related businesses, despite the church relying on long-standing status quo that exempt them from such taxes. They're awaiting the outcome of the negotiation between the State of Israel and the Vatican, which are expected to influence other churches as well. Overall, there's a perception that the state continuously tests their loyalty, but that's true also for the other countries or other state under the religious jurisdiction of the church leaders. Both the communities and the authorities do not always recognize and respect the complex maneuvering required to balance their diverse interests. The last group, these are Christian from outside, and I will relate to one of these groups, the evangelical Christians who support Israel and often referred as Zionist Christians. They view the return to Zion as the fulfillment of biblical prophecies, signaling the coming complete redemption. This group engage in political, religious, and economic support for the state of Israel and its right-wing messianic leadership, backing initiatives such as construction of a third temple, settlements, and continuation of the occupation. The state attitude towards these evangelical supporters is ambivalent. On one hand, government officials and authorities appreciate and exploit this love and support. But on the other hand, some religious elements express concern about the spiritual and moral implication of accepting funds and assistance from evangelical Christians. To summarize in a positive tone, at the Rossing Center for Education and Dialogue, one of our key areas of focus is raising awareness about the significance of Christian communities and their connection to the Holy Land. Our efforts target not only Israeli society as a whole, but also governmental authorities and decision makers. While we do not lobby in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, we engage with senior officials in various governmental ministries, maintain contact with the police, and collaborate with Ministry of Education and local municipalities to change perception. We aim to shift the view of Christians from being seen as a foreign entity that could either aid or threaten state interest to recognize them as an integral part of the cultural, social, and economic fabric of the Holy Land, encompassing both Israelis and Palestinian society. The state role should extend beyond merely acknowledging that the number of Christians is declining at a slower rate than in other regional countries. It should actively nurture the local Christian population. This includes helping the younger generation remain in the Holy Land rather than emigrate, ensuring sustainability of ecclesiastical institution, fostering social acceptance among the majority population, and supporting the ecclesiastical establishment in serving all communities, Christian, Muslim, Jews, and visitors from abroad. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Again, a reminder, if you have questions, you can feel free to add them to the Q&A at any time, and we'll get to them after our next speaker, Dr. Yusuf El-Khoury. Yusuf, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. I really appreciate Sam and Hannah's presentations, especially Hannah. You saved a lot of time for me to cover various issues here. My name is Yusuf El-Khoury, and this is very important. I will start with a personal story and briefly give a background of who I am and where I come from. And my second part will be a historical and current update on the state of the Christian Orthodox community in Gaza. And I will end by a prospect of the future, especially for the Christian community in Gaza. So personally, my name is Yusuf El-Khoury, which literally means Joseph the priest. And the reason that I have this last name is about 36 generations of my family were in the priesthood of the Orthodox Church, particularly in Gaza. Actually, the last priest of my family was 7 generations ago. His name was Habib and was located in Gaza City and served in the Church of St. Porphyrios. The same church where I was baptized, the same church where I served as a child. And it's the same church where I served in the scouting group of the Arab Orthodox, the church in Gaza. I lived in Gaza until I was 21 years old, and then I moved to the West Bank due to the political unrest in Gaza during the 2006-2007 period, and of course because of the general situation in Palestine. As a Palestinian Arab Christian, I'm rooted in this land for centuries. I appreciate Sam's historical survey of the Christian Orthodox presence in Palestine, which I feel my family is deeply connected to and part of this heritage. So I came from Gaza. I went to Christian school and public schools in Gaza. I had Christian friends and Muslim friends alike. During the last 20 or 30 years, the percentage of Christian population or the number of Christian population in Gaza severely declined over at least the last 30 years. However, the Christian community remained or continued to have some impact on the local community in terms of numbers of schools serving the Christian community in Gaza City, around 3 Christian schools. One of them is an Orthodox school, and of course other economic and even hospitals. The Christian community has played strong, I would say, economic power when it comes to jewelry and oil industries in Gaza for the last at least 30 or 40 or even more years. So this is who I am, and this is where I came from. Just looking to the historical and current situation in Gaza, and it's very important to go back to my childhood. I grew up, as I said, in the Greek Orthodox Church, but when I grew older, when I became a teen, I just explored the reality of the complex situation of the Orthodox Church in Palestine and particularly in Gaza. And to be honest here, as a teenager, I found out that the church is alienating Palestinian Arab Christian Orthodox from the reality on the ground, which is the Israeli settler colonialism and the role of the Christian, especially particular Christian theologies in emboldening the Israeli settler colonialism in Palestine. So the church tried always to separate the Palestinian, especially the Greek Holy Sepulchre fraternity, which had also, of course, a representation in Gaza to separate the congregation from the public sphere, particularly from politics. But that didn't spare the Palestinian Christian community in Gaza to be part of the subjugated community, the rest of the Christian and the Muslim community in Gaza under the Israeli settler colonial regime, in terms of restrictions on movement, in terms of what some would call it even the permission regime, where Palestinians are restricted to stay in Gaza and only allowed to travel to Jerusalem or Bethlehem for worship in the times of Easter or Christmas, if the Israeli militaries actually grants them a permission. So there was a severe restriction on religious freedom of Palestinian Christians, particularly also the Orthodox community in Gaza City. And by the way, in Gaza City, the vast majority of Christians are members of the Orthodox Church and historically were part of the Orthodox community until up to the late 19th century. So most of the Christian community historically belonged to the Orthodox Church and tradition. So part of that, you can see that the Christian community, particularly the Orthodox, inclined to move toward the Arab Orthodox cultural center and practices. It reminds us of the Arab culture, the Orthodox Arab Renaissance in the early 20th century, especially in Jerusalem, but also had a greater impact in Gaza. Up to the arrival of the PLO, somehow the representation of Christian community within the PLO and the PA, the Palestinian Authority, after the Oslo Accord in 1993, 1994, was more and more coming friendly. I remember the Palestinian president back then, Yasser Arafat, was invited almost annually to attend the midnight mass at the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. And almost every year he attended these celebrations. And the Orthodox Scouts were always on the forefront of welcoming the president and welcoming the PA. So they had this kind of friendly relationship with the PA. The Christian community flourished, I would say, between 1994 up to the early 2000s with the Palestinian Second Uprising in 2000. Since then, because of the added Israeli restrictions, of course, I remember back then in the early 2000s when I wanted to move from Gaza City to the south of Gaza, the Israeli military checkpoint in what's now even came back and returned to Gaza in Netzarim usually was closed. So the Israelis divided Gaza into three parts during that time up to 2005 when the Israelis withdrew and dismantled settlements in Gaza. So that time was very intense for the Christian community, and several families left Gaza Strip because of the intensity of the occupation on the ground. Between 2005 and we can say up to 2007, the shift in Palestinian internal politics from the PLO and PA to Hamas-led government, which actually, by the way, there was a Christian Palestinian from Gaza on the quota or on the Hamas representation in the Palestinian local government and the election. His name is Hussam al-Tawil. And Hussam remained as a member of Hamas or representing Hamas in the Palestinian parliament for years before his death a few years ago. Which means that sort of the Christian community in Gaza had some kind of an agreement with the local authority to keep some kind of, I would say, quiet profile when it comes because of the rise of the Islamic political movement in Gaza, but at the same time with respect to the Muslim community, and the government in Gaza back then remained faithful to offering security and safety to the local community and other services equally. Moving on to last year in 2023, and we need to keep in mind between 2007 and 2023, the Gaza Strip was under severe Israeli blockade, where people weren't allowed to move in or out of Gaza without Israeli permission, and including the Christian community, with lack of access to water, lack of access to electricity, which Israel controls completely when it comes to Gaza Strip, even medicine and food. And part of the communities that suffered under that, it's Gaza Christian community, the Orthodox also community, suffered under that way because they are an integral part of the Palestinian community, and they were treated as first and foremost as Palestinian Arabs. They weren't seen as favored Christians. They were always seen as Christian Arabs. I personally went through many episodes of humiliation, many episodes of attacks by the Israeli military on the border crossing or on other checkpoints, and of course, even in the seasons of Christmas and Easter while going to church in Jerusalem or in Bethlehem. So up to 2023, that was the situation in Gaza. I remember my mother had to wake up too early in the morning because the Israelis would connect power to Gaza so she can do like the dishes or she can do the laundry. So they had only 3 to 6 hours a day of power connection, and water, clean water and drinkable water was almost absent in Gaza. People had to really buy bottled water for drinking. Since October 2023, the majority of the Christian community sheltered in the two churches, the Catholic Church of the Holy Family and the Orthodox Church of St. Porphyrios. And my family was one of those families who sheltered at the St. Porphyrios Church, which, by the way, was the same church where my family sheltered in 1967 war. So my parents, my sisters, and their children sheltered at the Orthodox Church, where they experienced literally, and Father Michael and I, we almost were on daily basis texting back and forth. And they experienced starvation, they experienced severe lack of sleep because of the Israeli bombardment, shortage of water, shortage of fuel, medicine, to the point that I remember Bishop Alexius and Father Silas had to drive to some dangerous area in order to secure some flour for people in order to feed people. Certain times, people at the church were fed animal feed because there was lack of food and other basic needs. And during that time, between October and now, many people were lost in terms they were killed by the Israeli bombardment. Nearly more than 25 people were killed by the Israeli military in the Orthodox Church or the Catholic Church. 18 people were killed in the airstrike on 19th of October. Some of them were actually friends of mine, people I went to school with, and friends that I met just during my last visit to Gaza in 2022. Entire Christian families were wiped off the civil record, and innocent people, and all people are innocent, but even elderly people who were on the street, or even the two women who went to use the bathroom from their resident place or sheltering place in the Catholic Church to the bathroom, were killed by snipers, Israeli snipers. So this is just to give an overview of what's the reality of the Christian community in Gaza. And this moves me to my third point, the prospect of the future. But I cannot talk about the prospect of the future before looking at the present. The Christian population in Gaza before October was around 1,100 people, 1,100 people. Today, we are talking about 640 people who remain in this Orthodox and the Catholic Church combined. 640 people. And here I want to make clear a statement as a Palestinian Christian, as a theologian, as someone who's been writing recently on Gaza, the history of Christian community in Gaza, that we cannot remain somehow detached from the reality and pointing on the responsibilities of the churches, and particularly Zionism and Christian Zionism, that they had, and they've been the main factors that casted threat to the Christian presence in Palestine and in Gaza. Not radical Islam, by the way, not radical Islamic groups. Just looking at the last 20 years, you'll find that the Christian community in Gaza dropped over one third of the community either left Gaza, and of course 3% of the community killed in the last or in the current genocide that's taken place in Gaza. Meanwhile, in the past 20 years, only one Christian was killed by a radical Muslim group. So this just to make it the comparison, the real threat to the Christian Palestinian presence in Gaza and in entire Palestine is actually Zionism and Christian Zionism. This is what prompts me actually to write a paper recently, and I term what's happening to the Palestinian Christian body of Christ in Gaza as ecclesiocide, the extermination of the Christian community, the body of Christ in Gaza by the Israeli war machine. So this is the reality where I see that the prospect for the future is dark for the Christian community in Gaza. This is unfortunate, but we have to face this reality. And in response to this reality, I think the Orthodox community and the entire Christian community, but also we need people united in this sense of common humanity to stand for what's just, what's right, and what's will bring about peace and security for the Christian community in Palestine, which is in the Israeli settler colonialism, and Jewish supremacy in this land, and also I think nationalizing the church in Palestine, especially the Greek Orthodox Church.
Thank you, Yusuf. We have about a little over 25 minutes left. So I invite anyone to continue to add questions to the Q&A, which I will get to in a moment. But first, I would like to start with the panelists themselves, between Sam, Hannah, and Yusuf, if there are any questions you would like to ask each other.
I can ask a question to Hannah. Could you expand a little bit more on the situation of Christian citizens of Israel? And to what degree are they in a situation where they can or where they would want to take part sort of in full Israeli civic and cultural life?
It really depends who you ask, when you ask, and who is the person who's asking. I think you will have different voices that you will hear, and therefore, and maybe as an Israeli Jew, I'm not the person to present all of them, but I would say you will have few directions. You will have many, again, I cannot say how many percentage who have, I would say, you know, as a Jew, we know this from Jewish history, a mentality of integration. I mean, a mentality of minority to try to integrate and have a normal life in their, you know, they've been to different rulers and empires, and so they want to take care of that. And for that, they're ready to integrate to the extent that they will be accepted and the right will be accepted. And so to do some compromises, but to find a way to integrate. And I think you will find a lot of people who would say that we're ready to do that. If we accept it and we get our rights as equal rights because we are equal citizens of the state of Israel, we are ready to integrate. But you know, this is it's a very difficult process because Israel still finds itself in a state of war. So everyone who is Arab is considered to be an enemy, and they would never be able to really integrate into the society and accepted. And therefore, and then the law, the nation state law, as I said, was a slap on their face because they realized that what they suspected is actually the reality. They cannot really the society, the state is not really open to allow them to integrate. So then you have this, some people would have this kind of perception, and others would have other. But these are the different voices that you can hear in Israel, and that's why the nation-state law was surprising for many. That they thought, oh, we are integrated, we're nice Arabs, we're accepted into the Israeli society, and no, they're not really accepted, and I think this was very difficult for them to realize that, which was not surprising to people who are a bit realistic in Israeli.
Thank you, Hannah. Did you have a question as well?
Yeah, I want to go back to the history, something, after talking about, the situation in Gaza, I feel bad to talk about the history, but I will do that anyway. And I want to ask Samuel about the Arabization of the population, the Christian population in the Holy Land. If there are any Muslim elements that were included in the process of Arabization, or what's the place of Islam in the Arabinized Christian culture? Because Islam still has an important role in the Arab society in the 8th, 9th century as well as today.
Well, yeah, well, certainly. I mean, there's a presence of Arabic language, especially in southern Palestine, predating Islam. And it's impossible, or nobody has a good scholarly sound way of figuring out how much that feeds into Christian use of Arabic in later centuries. That's a bit contested. But when you first have texts that we can look at and translations and original compositions, no, there's an attempt to use religious vocabulary that's resonant with Muslims. And there's also, though, the first Orthodox Christian text originally composed in Arabic called On the Triune God that is very concerned with telling Christians to not socially interact with Muslims on the one hand, but on the same time, it's quoting the Quran. It's using a even more Islamic vocabulary than one might find in later texts. So no, Islam is part and parcel of the Arabic language as it is born as a literary language. And so Christians are always at every stage interacting with a language that's heavily informed by Islam. So you can't interact in Arabic without Islam being a presence to some degree.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have one or two questions of my own, but perhaps I'll get to the first question and then possibly come back. So we have our first question regarding especially the presence or historical influence of the Russian Orthodox Church in the Holy Land. And the question is primarily directed at Sam, but I think this is, and so I'll turn to Sam first, but I think this is something that maybe each of you can comment on. The question has to do with the reason behind the Russian Orthodox presence in the Holy Land. Could it be seen as imperial or perhaps colonial in nature? And if so, what would be the reasons for seeing it that way?
Well, okay. So if I started, because this is really more contemporary or 20th century question, people quite closer to the situation could answer. I would say I would not call it colonial simply because they're not trying to settle Russian Christians in the Holy Land outside of a few monks. I mean, that's not their game. At least as I understand Russia ecclesial policy vis-a-vis the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, they are interacting with the Patriarchate of Jerusalem as a way to have a pro-Russian element within the Greek-speaking sphere. And it looks to me, and perhaps I'm wrong and someone could correct me because I'm not following this extremely closely, but it looks to me like the Russians are doing all they can to not play up their historical connections with the actual Palestinian Christians on the ground and more interacting diplomatically with the Greek bishops who they can use as their spokespeople in a Greek context. Now that may be wrong, but I see it that way. As to whether it's imperial, that depends on if you want to qualify all Russian foreign policy as imperial, which is perhaps fair. I don't know. I'm not a specialist in Russian politics, but so I would say that if anything, it's their policy towards Ukraine has led them to be less engaged on the ground than they might have been otherwise.
Yes, the Russian Church in the Holy Land has a history of being closely affiliated with the people, especially 100 years ago. But I think you're right. More recently, it's been quite different. Although I would avoid, as some are wont to do, to see Russian church practice in other lands through the lens of Ukraine as well, because it does differ considerably.
Yeah, and it should be pointed out that there are a ton of Russian Israelis, some of whom are Christians, and a significant part of the Orthodox Christian population in Israel today, their degree of practicing may differ, but a lot of people who are baptized Orthodox Christians in the Holy Land are immigrants to Israel with Israeli passports from the former Soviet Union. And that's another aspect of this that's hard to take into account.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add anything to that? Or?
I think just to add on Sam's point, this is a recent struggle actually within the Palestinian Christian society and Orthodox now. The whole idea that you have an Orthodox Arab population who's native to this land, facing the reality that their Orthodox siblings are Russian, Israeli settlers practicing Orthodox now, might be in the military actively, or like we literally encounter them on military checkpoints where you think like, oh, but you are Christian like me and we are Orthodox, and how we can be in communion with one another. This is, I think, a question that will be posing itself on many of us in the near future, but it's been now discussed in more intellectual or smaller groups within the Christian Orthodox community.
So we have two questions related to the relationship between Christians in the Holy Land versus Christians in the West. One is from a more negative and one from a more positive angle, I suppose you could say. One is asking, why has there been, quote, deep silence, especially from Orthodox Christian leaders in America in regard to the situation in Gaza? And the other is asking about initiatives from Christians in the West, whether through the World Council of Churches or Christian peacemaker teams, that are worthwhile mentioning or exploring in regards to their countering of Christian Zionism, which seems to have the more significant influence among Christians in the West, at least by many perceptions. So I'm wondering if any of you would like to comment on the relationship between Christians locally, especially in Gaza, and Christians of the West more broadly.
I'll just say I think I don't want to comment about the specific question, but say that the perception is that Christian Zionism has a lot of impact. But I think the problem is not that they have so much impact as many other Christians are silent about what's happening in Gaza. So they're more vocal. I think that's one of the problems. But again, I leave the question to the Christians here.
I think I would refer even to Ilan Pape's recent book, Lobbying for Zionism, on both sides of the Atlantic. And you see that Christian Zionism isn't only a religious group that is vocal, but also has political power, especially in Europe and the United States. If you look up like Christian United for Israel, CUFI, since October 7th, their campaigns in the White House, even to stop any potential ceasefire. It's public. You can just look it up on their website, and they have a section on the impact they are making, withholding even any kind of support, humanitarian support for the Gaza people, even within the American government. And they are proudly posting about that. I think Hannah made a very important point. There is silence from the rest of the Christian community. The World Council of Churches is still hesitant about even calling what's happening in Palestine as a system of apartheid and what's happening in Gaza is a genocide. There is this kind of, I would say, soft diplomacy that hasn't been effective for years when it comes to the issue of Palestine and the Israeli settler colonialism. And of course, I need to bring up something, this whole idea of inter-religious dialogue that has been used and weaponized against the Palestinians and the Palestinian Christian people within even the WCC, which is, I think, needs to be revisited and reevaluated. Christian Zionism has been, I think, one of the biggest threats to Palestinian Christians, but again, the silence of the rest of the Christian community is complicity in what's happening in Palestine and for Palestinian Christians.
Sam, I know you've done quite a lot of work more recently in what we might call the geopolitics of the Orthodox world, a little bit. I've seen some of the work you have done, and I'm wondering if maybe if you have any thoughts on the relationship between, why Orthodox Christian leaders elsewhere do or do not wade in to the situation in Gaza, whether in the West or the East as well, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think Orthodox Christian leaders in general have a strong tendency to avoid speaking out on any matter of international politics that doesn't affect their own state churches. And this is a real problem in Orthodoxy in general about any issue, including Ukraine, that we're seeing. I think that's the primary reason that we don't have any comments on major events around the world because of that. I think that in also all of the Orthodox churches or state churches are engaged with the state of Israel in terms of pilgrimage, in terms of being able to send chaplaincies to Jerusalem and things like this. And I don't think they feel that much can be gained by annoying the Israelis particularly. But I think in general, there's just a lack of a strong Orthodox political voice on any issue. I mean, unless, okay, the Greeks will talk about Cyprus, the Georgians will talk about Abkhazia, but they won't talk about issues that go beyond their immediate states.
My impression, when we discuss it, when I discuss it with colleagues or with clergy, is that the church perception or perceive itself as an institution that exists for 2,000 years. And through these 2,000 years, there were issues, there were challenges, but there were temporary one. And, there were the Romans and then the Crusaders and the Muslims and the Ayyubs so it's not like they're gonna burn all their cards, throw all their cards and ruin their reputation for another challenge or another difficult day. And I think it helps them. I mean, I find it encouraging in my daily reality that I feel so depressed every day I open the news and something bad happened. But I meet members of the clergy here, Catholic or Orthodox, and there's some kind of a vision that goes beyond the next few years. And I think in that sense, this is the church attitude. I don't want to, to get too much involved because I have to keep, this institution functioning for the future generation. And that's the way they dealt with that in the past. And they continue to deal with it in the present. So on one hand, I understand the criticism, but on the other hand, I also understand their fear to get too much involved and to keep kind of moderate reaction to things.
If I could piggyback on that, I would also say that Orthodox Church institutions have a pre-democratic way of thinking about things. Our idea that leaders should speak out and take a moral stand on all kinds of various issues comes from our experience of democracy, which is not the deep sort of psychological software of Orthodox Church institutions. And yeah, I don't see that changing without internal structural changes that aren't on the in the cards.
Also relevant to this question, then, if I can add another one, it's something that's been touched upon, I mean, by each of you in different ways, but the relationship of the local Orthodox Church and other Christians in the Holy Land to their major centers elsewhere, you know, especially like with regard to the local Catholic Church and relationship to the Vatican. Because Yusuf mentioned toward the end the importance, I think you used the word nationalize, which I mean may have different meanings in different contexts, but at least in giving the local population more of a say in the local church. And Hannah mentioned her colleague's book, Ramon's book on Christians in Christianity in Israel. And I'm wondering if maybe each of you in different ways might like to could comment on the I guess pluses and minuses of the churches in the Holy Land having a strong affiliation or even oversight outside of the land versus those that are entirely based locally. Because this has fluctuated throughout history, whether or not this has been a positive thing, or you know, to exercise weight on the government, so to speak, or a negative thing. So I'm wondering if either of you can comment on that.
I think most of the churches have this international outside center that they can relate to, even if we're talking about local evangelical churches. I think they always see themselves as connected to a center somewhere else. And I think it helps the churches to have more influence or to feel more protected, even if practically Yusuf doesn't feel that, but it does have an impact. I mean, you as an individual. So I think it does have an impact, both sides, from the state and from their own perspective of the reality. And again, it's also that you don't look at the church as something local, but it's a wider perspective. It's part of something bigger. It's not the individual or the small community that struggle, but they're part of something bigger that support them. So I think this is a source of inspiration, it's an encouragement, and again, I find in these times I find a lot of encouragement when I meet Christian friends and clergy, because they have some kind of a wider perspective than our own tiny.
We just had three more questions come in late, but I'm wondering if either of you would like to address what we're this question of the relationship between the churches in the Holy Land and their authorities or centers abroad.
I would answer this question as a Palestinian, you know, and just putting aside my scholarship, and I'll tell you my feelings and how they evolved over the years. I totally understand the politics of the church, especially when it comes to the international centers, if it's in Greece or in Italy, in the Vatican. However, as a Palestinian Christian who grew up in the church, I feel alienated by the church, and I feel unheard within the church. And I feel that the church cares more about its politics rather than the local community. And my fear is these churches will become literally museums for the Holy Sepulchre fraternity and the Catholic Patriarchy. Let's be honest about it. I think everyone wants a piece of the Holy Land or the Holy Cake when it comes to what's happening here. Everyone wants to have a foothold in Palestine with disregard the local Palestinian community and the Arab community. This has happened for centuries, to be clear. And when I talked about nationalization, I'm not talking about only just the whole idea of Palestinization of the church. I think the church has to be indigenous and reflects the indigenous interests of the people, not what the international community or not what the Pope in Rome wants, or a patriarch who's Greek, who's literally has no history in this land, who does not belong to this land, who does not have this this kind of rootedness to Palestine. This is an issue for us, that we feel underrepresented, we feel suppressed in many ways, and we feel that we are sometimes abused by the church structures. Just being congregants and members and talking about us as local communities, but we are being taken advantage of. And let me be sincerely honest here, and with all due respect. Many Palestinian Christians feel that all of those church structures, including the Greek Orthodox one, unfortunately, these are colonial structures. That's not only my opinion. Actually, even historians of the Greek Orthodox Church in Palestine would agree on that. They move by Orientalist mindset, where they look at the Arab Palestinian population and congregants, even sometimes as hindrance to their interests in keeping this Christian heritage in Palestine, which is only the monasteries and the churches and the structures, rather than the living stones, the Christian community who's remained in this land for the last 2,000 years. Forgive my brutal honesty on this.
Sam, would you like to add anything to that from the historical?
No, I would simply say that, yes, that when we talk about churches, we're talking about two different things often. And there's the actual Christians and the structure of the church. And this is a problem for Orthodox ecclesiology and practice everywhere, whether we're talking about in the Holy Land, whether we're talking about Syria, whether we're talking about in Turkey, etc. That there's Orthodoxy has developed, and maybe a misadaptation to keeping ecclesial structures without people, and having a sort of the church being the bishops without reference to the people. And this is, I think, a problem across Orthodoxy to various degrees. And so when we talk about the church, we need to really be clear to ourselves who we're talking about. And I think Yusuf pointed that out very well.
Perhaps those, I do not think we'll be able to be respectful of our all the participants' time, since it's now after 10 or 11 where all of you are. Maybe I'll draw one final question, a practical question about how to contribute or benefit or help the Christian communities of the Holy Land. We have a specific question about the organization Friends of the Holy Land, asking especially to Yusuf, but perhaps Hannah might be able to know well on this too, whether it's a useful organization that does useful work for channeling support to the local, especially Orthodox communities, or if there's another way you might suggest in offering support.
I'm not familiar with their work, but I always say, if you want to support, come, maybe not now, but come to the Holy Land, listen to the different voices, try to be not judgmental, try to be open to hear the different voices and understand that we're not talking about one narrative and one reality, but we have narratives and histories and heritages, and everything comes here in plural, and things are complicated. And there's pain and there's hope in both sides, and be open to support both sides, because Yusuf and I want to live together, want to find a way to live together with all this very difficult reality. And we will appreciate that you will support and empathize with both of us. Not if not as people, at least as two humans who are standing here in front of you and talking. I think that's the most important support. Obviously, wherever it's needed to have physical material support is also need for that. For Palestinians in different places in Gaza, definitely. But in general support, I would say, be open to listen to us, both of us. I mean, both people.
I think we can consider ourselves one people. This is what we are looking for, and this is what we are aiming for, Hannah. And I'm not familiar with their work. I know, and I've checked their team in the Holy Land, many familiar faces, people I know. And I agree with Hannah. As much as this support to the Christian community locally here is important and critical at this moment, What we need more is stability in this land. And we need catalysts for peace rather than only momentum support in this current situation. Please come and see us, listen to our stories, learn more about us, be part of a vision for peace that brings about reconciliation and healing between the Palestinians and Israelis. Let me be honest here, as a Palestinian theologian and as a Palestinian Christian, I'm not advocating for one land for one group of people. I'm advocating that this land become an example of coexistence and reconciliation and healing between two groups of people that everyone thought never can reconcile. I think Palestine, Israel two groups of people from other religious minority can be example of what I call a divine miracle in this land. So please, Christian communities around the world have been, unfortunately, part of the struggle. They poured into the continuation of this war and the Israeli settler colonialism. I think we need more catalysts within the Christian community to be for peace. So come see us, come meet us. I think it's important to be in contact with someone like Hannah and Rossing Center. Come see us here in Bethlehem. I work at Bethlehem Bible College. It's a Christian institution. And just check out on the Christian community in Gaza too, without even needing to send them any money. Just sending a text to the Orthodox Church in Gaza, just checking on people and letting them know that you are praying for them, and hopefully one day you'll come to visit them. This is what's really important at this moment of history.
Thank you, Yusuf. Perhaps we'll end it there unless there are any last comments from the other panelists that they would like to offer. Sound good? Okay, then I will conclude by saying thank you everyone for joining. This recording, I believe, should be available through the Orthodox Christian Study Center. And I hope you will encourage both the center and any other institution to do more on addressing or drawing attention to the Christians of Gaza. If you would like to be in touch with any of our speakers, you can find my email address at the University of Scranton Theology website, and I'm happy to put you in touch, especially for those questions that we did not get to tonight.